Today I'm excited to share my new game art that I created and show you some awesome tricks of creating this artwork in Blender. I drew inspiration from the legendary game The Last of Us, especially its iconic background. I played this game years ago, but the new HBO series recently brought these unforgettable scenes back to my mind, inspiring me to create this. I always loved these symmetrical compositions, so I decided to recreate something similar with my own style. Besides the main scene, I also added visual effects like fire, rain, and post effects, all done using only Blender. But before we jump into the tutorial, I wanna share a quick words about Skillshare. That's a perfect for leveling up your creative skills, and it's sponsoring today's video. Skillshare is a large online community for creatives with thousands of classes on animation, design, illustration, and filmmaking. It's a perfect platform to turn your skills into success, whether you're a hobbyist or building a creative career. Also, Skillshare is great for mastering Blender. You can dive into Blender classes on cinematic lighting to make your scenes stand out, learn product design to bring your idea to reality, or master texturing for beautiful environments. These classes, led by industry pros, use a hands-on style, so you build projects, share for feedback, and create awesome Blender renders. What makes Skillshare special? It's a flexible platform, letting you learn at your own pace, beginner or pro. Explore classes on visual effects for cinematic animation, motion graphics, traditional art like painting, sketching, or marketing to grow your creative brand. Every class is made by creative for creative to spark your passion. The first 500 people to click my link or scan this QR code will receive 1 month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Huge thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now let's dive into this game Blender art. And as I already said, this composition is symmetrical. This big tree is the center, and everything is being built around this tree. So I have a 3D scan of a large tree that I think fits this art perfectly, and use Blender's file browser. I search for the models and simply drag and drop the FBX file into the scene to import it. And that's where we start. I leave this imported tree in the center of the scene and building everything around it. Next, I quickly add the plane to this 3D scene and subdivide it to sculpt the terrain. I so often show this landscape creation process using sculpting in my videos, so I will not focus on it too much here. There are more interesting and exciting parts of this scene to talk about. I also added some enhancements asset to support this landscape creation, creating a platform for this tree and the center part of the scene, with forests scattering into the distance towards the city behind the scene. So this is the foundation of my landscape for this artwork, which we'll continue working on now. And I already gathered some models for this project, including another large tree to enhance this scene. So I drop this pine tree into my main scene, but we can see it doesn't quite fit. If I look at this render, there are only large trunks, and the tree's foliage is barely visible in some areas. The problem is, we can't just scale the tree because then we also scale the foliage. This isn't the right way to handle trees if they don't match the size you need. So here's how I solve this issue. I go in Edit mode. Here I can select just the trunk. Press L to select the entire trunk, and then press P to separate selection. Now I can move this trunk independently and slide this foliage up. Most importantly for this scene, I can scale the trunk separately from the rest of the tree to match the look I want in my render. And the foliage itself isn't as crucial for this art, I'm more focused on this trunk. So when placing these points around the scene, I can even duplicate just the trunk without the foliage, scale and rotate it separately. In some spots I might use this full tree and I can still move the foliage independently while keeping it in the correct size. I think this is a common mistake for beginners scaling trees without considering the size of leaves or needles. This is a huge mistake, especially when working with large-scale scenes. So alright, let's move on to the exciting part of this tutorial. I enable the preview render, and now let's dive into the lighting, especially how to create atmospheric light in Blender. Look at my render, you can see the lighting system is built on two lights, an ambient environment light and spotlight that mimics a sunbeam. So let's start with the spotlight. It's pretty straightforward, you know. We can easily add a spotlight to the scene, move and rotate it to create a sunray effect, increase the power to nice glow and bring some foliage closer to this light. Then increase the radius to soften the shadows, and it looks good. But since we're using Blender, some obvious things can be done even more simpler. In my assets browser I have a texture light, for example one with leaves. I drop this light into scene, move it up, and now we get beautiful forest shadows on the ground and trees without using any 3D geometry to cast them. Here's how it works. Basically we can project a simple texture using this spotlight. If I open the image editor, you can see that I use simple black-white texture of leaves I created from a photo which I took in the forest. Normally, a spotlight only has an emission node in the shader editor when you enable use nodes. I connect this black and white texture to this emission node, and it projects onto the scene as the shadows. I also adjust the radius of these spotlights to make the shadows softer. With a radius of 0, the shadows are too sharp, as you can see, but increasing it gives a more natural look. Texture lighting in Blender is an incredible feature. I use this feature all the time in my artworks, and I'd even say it's one of the main reasons why I fully switched to working in Blender. You can see that rotating this light creates nice cast shadows in the forest without needed actual forest geometry, you know. I also tweak the light color to warmer tone like sunlight for more natural feels. Next, let's talk about the bluish ambient light in my render. To achieve this, I use a volume effect. Add a new cube to the scene, scale it, and move it away from the camera to act as a background. In the shader editor, I add volume BSDF, lower the density, and use an emission in this volume shader to set the light's color and intensity. With these simple steps, we get the same color setup as in my render. Of course, we could use the environment color to adjust the lighting since it affects the scene's base light, but the core setup comes from combining the volume light and texture light. So let's go over again. I use Blender's global environment color, a spotlight with texture light to create spotlight with leaf shadows, and volume cube for the background light. Alright, let's move forward and focus on the ground and the main tree. In the render you can see the ground has roots and forest-like textures. And it's pretty straightforward, no quick secrets here, you know. I'm using Megascans texture for this, just apply this texture, and to get these nice roots I enable displacement in the material settings. Of course we need to scale the texture using the mapper node. For realistic displacement I need subdivision surface modifier to subdivide this ground even more. Then I adjust the strings of the displacement to get the look I want. And yeah, a quick note on optimization, because displacement uses a lot of resources, So I always use Blender's simplify settings. It's my even default settings in Blender. These settings let me limit the global subdivision for the scene, both in the 3D viewport and for the rendering. Also, I set a 4K texture limit for the final render and 2K for the viewport as well. These settings keep your graphic card from overloading. Since we added displacement to the ground, I move this tree up a bit to adjust for these changes. Now let's add the texture to the trunk. And as you remember, this trunk is Megascan model, so it already has textures we could use, but as for me, they don't fit the scene because I want the rougher bark textures, like the surrounding trees I already placed here. So I apply new textures to this model, which looks much better I think, and scale it slightly to fit it. We also need to match this texture to what's already in the scene. Right now the texture is too bright, but we can fix that easily. First, I have an ambient occlusion texture from this texture pack and we can use it. I add a mix color node, connect this ambient occlusion texture and set the blending mode to multiply. And that's good. Next, I add a hue saturation node between the base texture and this mix color node to lower the value, making this base texture darker. Finally, I add the color ramp after this mix color node to tweak this color slightly, matching the bark to my scene. Perfect, that's done. Now it's time to add a hero to the scene, a guitar. This is original guitar model like the one from The Last of Us game, which I found on Sketchfab. I drove it into the scene and rotated slightly to face the viewer to the angle of this guitar, as if someone like Ellie maybe left it here recently before exploring the world around. Awesome. Now let's move to scattering grass and ferns, and I have ferns model from Megascan as well as grass models also from Megascans, and let's start with these ferns. I select these fern models, choose the surface, press W and start drawing the ferns into the surface. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, I'm using the Secret Paint add-on for this. It's a free Blender add-on, Secret Paint, available in Blender extension, you can use it for free. And this add-on lets me scattered foliages with simple brushes in Blender. And for me, it's a really fun way to place objects in the scene. I just select the model and start painting them around the scene. In the foreground, I do the same things. The Secret Paint add-on has all their own settings, so I can slightly adjust the scale of these ferns using these scale settings and random scale options, like this. I might also use the remove brush to clean some areas, so the foreground ferns don't block the main object in the artwork too much. The add-on also allows use other brushes like this grow brush to adjust the local scale. In this way I can tweak special areas without affecting all these plants around the scene, creating a more natural, growing foliage effect. And I do the same for the grass, painting it around the main trunk and in the foreground. And the main goal is to fill the foreground with details, since it's more noticeable part in the scene, so we need to maximize the details here. I might go back to this fern scatter and add some ferns closer to the hero tree for extra details. Yeah, looks good. I also want to cover this tree with moss, also using this Secret Paint add-on. I scatter moss from the polyheaven. I select the moss models, choose the trunk and start painting the moss onto the tree. These models are so tiny, so I increase the density, maybe even set it to 0 for maximum density. And I also increase the scale and paint around the trunk to give it a nice mossy look. To create a smooth transition between the ground and the trunk, I want the moss to blend from the ground into this trunk, into this tree. I think this will look much more natural. So to do this, I switch to the ground and paint the same moss around the base of this tree. This creates a green island in our post-apocalyptic world, something like this. And you can see it forms a smooth, natural transition between ground and the tree. So I use the same process to scatter trees and create a forest with this secret painted on. Now let's move on to the details. I have some models for this, like cars and bus stop, so I drop them into my main scene. Let's start maybe with this car. I like this model, by the way. And I think I place this somewhere here, similar to the original The Last of Us background. I move it to a spot among the trees and rotate it to look nice in the frame. But I noticed one tree is growing right through the car, so we need to fix this. And I go back to Secret Painted On and I use brushes to move this tree within the scatter system, so moving only one tree without touching other trees. Even though the tree growing through the car isn't visible in the frame, it's better to move it for more realism. Next, I place another car on the opposite side of the composition, as if it got stuck and become overgrown with plants over time. And this also supports the composition. So first of all, it creates a symmetrical frame with objects evenly placed around the central object. Second, the direction of this car points towards the same central object. I'm thinking about making a tutorial on composition to explore different ways to use this technique for various scenarios in the frame, so subscribe to my channel and my Patreon to stay updated on new videos. But next, I place the bus stop behind the forest, as if there used to be a road and stop there. I don't think this is just a forest, you know, it feels like it was once a park before everything changed. Those who played The Last of Us game might recognize this location, as I remember it's a Pioneer Station or something like this. And to emphasize this, I had a bus stop sign for extra detail. Yeah, looks good. I also had a street light to hint that this was once a park area. Alright, there is one small detail that really affects the story I'm trying to tell in this scene. Take a look. If I zoom into this bus stop sign, you can see it's pretty very clean model, you know, this model like the other has clean materials, which clearly doesn't match the post-apocalyptic vibe of our scene, right? It's obvious these models aren't designed for such dramatic scenes, but we can fix this right in Blender. I add another Principled BSDF shader to the existing one in the shader editor, and I have some rusty metal texture, and I'm going to apply them to this new Principled BSDF. And let's see how it looks. I also uncheck the world light to view this model more clearly in the 2D viewport, and yeah, that looks good. Maybe I'll just scale the texture a bit. Now I have the original material from the model and the new rusty metal material, and we can blend them. I add a mix shader node to combine these two materials, and I also need a mix color node for displacement. But since this original material doesn't have displacement, I set the color to black in this mix color node, where the displacement from this material would normally connect. By the way, it already looks cool, but I want to show you another approach. In the rusty material, as I know, there is roughness texture that can act as a mask to blend these two materials. So using color ramp, I can adjust the range of this map or even invert it and use this as a factor to mix these two shaders. This allows me control which part of the model keeps the original material and which one gets covered by rusty metal. It's like the paint has played off over time, leaving hints that this was once a road sign. So something like this, yeah. Now this model fits perfectly, I would say, into our post-apocalyptic scene. Yeah, awesome. And I also applied the same rusty texture to other materials like the street light and bus stop, but the car model were already prepared for walking such some kind of scene, so I didn't touch them. Alright, in this final artwork we can see visual effects like fire and some particles from this fire. Sure, we could save this render and finish this in Photoshop, but no way. We are doing it all in Blender, and there is a good reason for that. We can add these effects right in 3D viewport, like 3D matte painting, you know. So I start by adding a plane, rotate it along the x-axis, and move it inside the car. Then I create a new material, and I drop in video footage of fire, which we can see in the 3D viewport. You could use a still image of fire, but using video footage has a big advantage. Even though this is still artwork, I might decide to animate it later, who knows. Since the video footage has many frames, I can shift the frame line with this offset to pick a more interesting frame from this footage. Plus, I can duplicate this plane in other parts of the scene, adjust this offset and get different fire effects from one footage instead of using multiple images. Next, I use the same video as an emission in the shader, and now we see this fire in the scene. So I scale and move it a bit. But you can still see the original plane in the 3D viewport, so we need to remove everything except the fire. The obvious solution is to use an alpha channel, but this video doesn't have one. What can we do to create an alpha channel? And in Blender, it's almost one-click fix. I add a hue saturation node, connect this video footage, and at first nothing changed. But when I set the saturation to 0, we get black and white image, which works great for an alpha channel. I connect it to the alpha input, and now only the fire is visible on the plane. I can also add the color ramp to this alpha channel to adjust the image range. So now I duplicate this plane to the opposite side, placing somewhere here, but we can see an unpleasant effect. The fire cuts off sharply at this plane's edges. To fix this, I go to edit mode and subdivide the plane using a loop cut. I make sure to enable correct face attributes in the transform options here. This feature allows us to edit the object while keeping the texture mapping impact, so this texture doesn't stretch. I can remove some faces on the plane or move edge and the image will not distort. Blender adjusted proportionally to the new geometry. This allows me to use the plane's vertices to select the exact part of the texture I want, trimming the image further. See, I can move the vertex to get rid of any incorrect parts of the image. And here's the big advantage of using this in Blender that I mentioned. I add a point light in the same spots as these planes, increase the radius, set a color to match the fire, and boost the power. Look at that. Now the fire effects light up the object around it, making the scene feels alive. And I think it's clear that trying to paint all these fire details and lighting effects on surrounding objects in Photoshop would be a huge hassle. And in Blender we easily got everything done right in the 3D scene. And of course, using the same method, I can easily add fire particles right in Blender. Add a plane and move it in the same position in the scene. I couldn't find good particle video footages, but I have some overlay images, so we can use it in the same way. I add this image to the base color, connect it to the emission, and increase emission strings. Again, I add a hue saturation node, remove the saturation to 0 to create an alpha channel from this image. As you can see, it works great even without any simulation. But these particles look too sharp, and I think we need to blur them a bit to add some dynamic, as if they flying out from the fire. To do this, add a mapping to the image texture in the shade editor, then place a mix color node between the mapping and this texture, and next I add a noise texture and connect it to this mix color node. You can already see some motion blur in the scene, but I increase the noise size to larger value, and by adjusting the factor we can control the blur and the motion blur effect. Just be careful not to overdo it. In this way we can add various effects directly in Blender. As you can see, the main advantage is that these effects interact with the scene, saving us from having to manually paint all these details in Photoshop or some other software. Alright, let's move to the background of this composition, and I have some building models in my collection that I already adjusted to fit this current story, making them look like they're covered in moss or something similar. Originally this had a simple brick texture and this basic grass texture. I also created a noise mask with color ramp to choose where I want the grass and bricks appear. By connecting everything, I got an effect that makes these buildings look like they've been staying in a harsh post-apocalyptic environment for years. So alright, I drop them into my main scene and place them somewhere in the background. And you may have noticed we have been walking from the foreground to the background this whole time, and there is a reason for that. I always approach project in this order, so from the most important elements to the less critical one, from foreground to background. First, this helps me focus on what matters most, which is key. Second, it allows me to optimize the scene efficiently, arranging scenes so I don't waste time or resources on minor details. Also, for example, for these background buildings, I don't use any displacement and stick to simple textures. We will not even see them clearly because they are always covered by fog in this scene, but they're important to create the feeling that the scene doesn't just end where the forest visually stops. There is a world beyond, and we can still see the silhouettes of these buildings, giving us the sense of depth. Alright, let's wrap up with some color correction and post-production. The scene already looks great, but I want to add some post-effects to make it even better. I will use Blender Real-Time Compositor, and firstly I enable the compositor for the camera. And before jumping into the Real-Time Compositor, I go to Blender's Compositing workspace because I need to create masks. You could use the image editor for this, but since I already had opened the image editor in Compositing, I'll make the mask here. I need two masks. The first is a circle mask, I place it in the center of the image and add a large feather effect to soften the edges, something like this. The second is a square mask, which I place at the bottom of the image. Good. Now I return to the main layout, back to the 3D viewport and the real-time compositor, because it works much faster in Blender. So to use the masks, I add a mask node and select the first mask. Next I duplicate this node and select the second mask. Why do I need this? The first mask is for vignette effect on the render, so I add a new color balance node, connect this mask as a factor, and invert this mask to apply the effect on the edges of the image. Using color balance, I docker these edges to create a vignette and tweak the color wheels to make it cooler, maybe adding some bluish tones. Check out the difference before and after. Nice. Next, I add another color balance node and connect the second mask to create darker shadow in the foreground, emphasizing the main focus of the artwork. Something like this, yeah. Awesome. Now I add another color balance node for global color gradient. Then I include a hue correct node to work with colors separately. For example, I can make the blue tones brighter to add more air perspective to the scene. I can also shift the blue slightly towards magenta using the hue correct. By the way, see how fast this works in 3D viewport with real-time compositor. I might also boost the saturation for the yellow tones. So look at this difference, before and after. Now there is more focus on the main object in the scene. Oh, one more thing I just thought of. With the vignette added, it's a bit dark but clean. We can add more gloss to the fern leaves for amazing effect. I love to use such effect, look at this. I select a fern model and go to the shader. There is already a color ramp in the roughness map, and I tweak it to add more glossy highlights to the material. See that effect? These shiny highlights on the leaves really boost the atmosphere, right? Now I'll go back to compositor and reduce some of the darkness a bit. Alright, let's compare before and after. Yeah, that's much better. Finally, let's add some post effects. I add a glare node and switch it to bloom for atmospheric glow that highlights the reflections and fire. Then I add a touch of lens distortion, just a little bit. Yeah, awesome. Finally, I decided to add rain to this scene. Since we already added glossy reflections on the leaves, it feels like the scene could have wet and rainy conditions. This will also help me separate the scene into two parts: the warm, cozy central part and the rest of the scene where the rain creates a harsh, unwelcoming environment you wouldn't want to step into. I think the rain will really enhance the atmosphere we'll build. So I will use the same approach we used for the fire, which I call 3D mod painting, because that's essentially what it is. I add a new plane to the scene and create a new material. I have a pack of overlay images with rain and I'll pick one, maybe this one. I connect it to the base color, but it's not very visible at first. There, now you can see the raindrops, but it's not quite what I wanted. Instead, I'll use this image as an alpha and add emission to boost the rain effect. Yeah, that's much better. Alright, let's place it maybe somewhere here. I scale it and move it back a bit. Something like this, yeah. Next, add a color ramp to the image to increase the contrast, making a rain more visible. Yeah, that's better. Of course, I don't want the rain to look like a solid wall, so I add a noise texture to make it less uniform. I include a color ramp and a mix color node in the alpha channel, using this noise as a factor. Now the rain looks varied, so more visible in some areas and barely noticeable in others. I think it's nice. I'll scale the plane along the x-axis to cover this part of the scene, and I might also mirror this plane to rotate the rain in the opposite direction. By adding a mapping node to the rain image, I can adjust the rain's angle. Yeah, that looks good. I duplicate this plane to the opposite side of the composition, and this is really atmospheric. I love how the rain ties the whole artwork together. Alright, this is final artwork from this video, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. By the way, let me know in the comments which other movies or games you would like to see me recreate. I might create some similar in the future, and I've been thinking about making art and concept based on famous scenes time after time, so it could be a great idea. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss new tutorials and videos, and check out my Patreon where subscribers get access to a lot of exclusive content. So that's all for today, see you in the next time.